Hi all, welcome to Chapter 13 about public communication, and that's what it's called in the book. It's what we usually refer to as public speaking. So this isn't a public speaking class, but we'll go quickly over some of the key concepts that you're going to need to know, both for this class and any others. So first of all, we'll do a quick refresher from Chapter 11 about group communication, and then the goals for this quick video are to talk about speech anxiety, organization patterns and organizations of speeches in general, and then some delivery how-tos and reminders. All of these things I'm guessing you've seen in other public speaking courses, so we're not going to go too in-depth, but make sure you ask questions if you have them. So thinking back to group communication, the questions that I have for you, which you should be able to answer from your notes or off the top of your head, are: what are the 4 types of communication in groups? How should these types of communication be balanced in order to achieve an effective work team? Right, so there's some different functions and types of communication. How do they work together? What is groupthink versus what is synergy? And also be considering how do we achieve either of those? And then what is the ideal small group size and why is that the ideal size? What makes it ideal for us? So if you don't know these things, pause, go check out your notes and figure out what you don't yet know. But when we talk about Chapter 13, about public communication, these are the questions that Wood is framing her chapter around. Right? Just so she talks about to what extent is public speaking similar to conversation? How can speakers enhance their credibility? What are the advantages and disadvantages of different delivery styles? How can speakers manage speaking anxiety? And how can you listen critically to others' public speeches? Most of these are answered pretty clearly in the chapter. We'll hit some keynotes here about some of the crucial concepts, and then that last question of how can you listen critically to others' public speeches, there's actually a different overview slideshow about evidence, because evidence is going to be the crucial piece about you as a listener and as a speaker that you really need to have a good grasp on how to do it credibly and reliably. So first of all, let's talk about managing speaking anxiety, because it is often stated it's the #1 fear in the U.S. A lot of folks say they hate it, but really with practice, it's not that bad. Right? But the key here is you have to be prepared, you have to be organized. When you're trying to get up and wing it, that's when that anxiety really shows through. Because remember, if you don't tell your audience that you're nervous, if you don't constantly apologize to your audience, if you don't walk up there and say, hey, I'm sorry, I'm sick, this isn't going to go so well, don't do any of those things. Right? You want to start off strong, and your audience is really unlikely to know what's going on inside you unless you tell them. So one of the biggest things about speaking anxiety is tons of practice, and not just practicing in your head, but actually reading the speech out loud. It makes a huge difference because it also helps you reword if there's a sentence or two where you're having trouble kind of even articulating them. If you shift some words around, if you realize you're repeating yourself again and again, it helps you to be more concise and clarify once you hear it out loud for yourself. If you're really brave, you can get an outside audience member, a friendly roommate. So definitely crucial points for trying to manage that anxiety is to be well prepared. One of the things that helps with this is they've actually shown that positive thinking, for instance, pre-game visualization, are very effective in helping folks with a positive speaking experience. And we've shown that your body's feelings of excitement, the response to excitement is actually the same as the response to nerves, right? The sweaty palms, the red face, the short breath. And so one of the things they recommend doing, sounds cheesy, is instead of telling yourself how nervous you are, you take a step back and you use the term excited instead. And it helps shift our thinking by using that different word. As much as you can, try to create a comfortable speaking atmosphere. So if you feel like you need water, have water with you. If you feel like you need your own timer, use your own timer. When you have a little bit more control over the room itself and the setup, make sure it's set up in a way that assists you and makes you comfortable. And make the most of your resources, right? So audience members, using library presentation rooms. There's some great resources through the library where you can actually run through practicing a whole presentation with equipment. You can often record yourself. So all of those are good things to use, and don't put things off to the last minute because then you can't make the most of those resources. So speaking anxiety is something that a lot of folks experience. Try and help yourself through that if you're someone who knows that speaking makes you nervous. There's a lot of ways we can work with this. And as always, you are more than welcome to come and talk to me. And I've got some other tips and tricks that if you really need them, we can talk about in person. So being prepared and organized for a speech is not only crucial for trying to balance speech anxiety, it's really crucial for success at all. And so these are some crucial questions that you have to be able to answer before putting together a presentation. And you'll notice that quite a few of these are the same questions that you would have to answer if you were writing an essay. So you need to be able to say, what is the exigency? And exigency is a fancy word for what is the need in this situation? What do I need to accomplish? What needs to be fixed? What do we need to change? Why am I writing this? What's the point? So the exigency means the need of the situation. So what's the need here? Why am I bothering to do this? Right? And so your goal to inform the audience of something that's going on? Is your goal to entertain the audience? Is your goal to memorialize someone? Is your goal to persuade your audience members? So informing is really just you are giving new information. Persuading, on the other hand, is you may still need to give more information, but you then take that step further and say, and here's how this information helps us get to, this is why I think we need to do this or think this. Let me influence your actions and your thoughts. Right? And so anytime you're saying you should do something, that's no longer an informative speech. That shifts into the persuasive realm. You really have to know who your audience is in order to craft a good speech. And so this word demographics, you're likely to have seen before. And what it means is, what are the stats of who makes up your audience? How old are they? What generation are they? What members are they groups of? Right? So if you're talking to DU alums versus another school, you're going to talk differently, depending what the topic's about. Gender, sex, age, race, ethnicity, religion, all sorts of different kind of categories that we might put people into. So that's this idea of demographics. So demo, remember, is people. And so you're kind of counting people. But it's also important to think about not just that categorized makeup of your audience, but also, is this an audience who's on your side or no? So there's a couple different ways we talk about this. Most of us have heard the term hostile audience. A hostile audience is you go in and someone is actively against you, right? So let's say you support contraception, right? So you support the right to birth control. And you are going to try and give a speech convincing very conservative religious groups that everyone should have access to birth control. You are going to be talking to a hostile audience because what you're talking about goes against their views. Right? And so it's going to be very, very difficult to put them on your side. So with a hostile audiences, more often what we're doing is we're not aiming for a total flip in perspective. We're often aiming just for a little nudge to try and kind of convince them that you're not totally evil just because they don't agree with you. A committed audience, they're already committed to your cause. They are on your side. You are preaching to the choir. But we still have to do that occasionally. We still have to kind of remind people why we're all on the same side, what it does that we're all on the same side. And then a captive audience is, for instance, you in class, right? So you are required to be in class. There are repercussions if you're not. So I pretty much can talk about what I want because you're a captive audience. And we see this in some other situations also. So captive audiences, committed audiences, and hostile audience members. There are some different types of delivery. I'm guessing many of you have heard these before. This idea of impromptu is going to be, you've got no preparation time to maybe a few minutes, right? So you still need to come up with some way to organize. Very, very strong speech writers and givers can do this very well with just a little bit of preparation, and it's because they know the rules of what works. Right? You can't just make it up on the spot if you don't have the background knowledge and expect it to be really strong. So some of the topics that we're talking about help you even when you're trying to produce this impromptu, very off-the-cuff speech. Extemporaneous is the goal of most public speaking classes, and what that means is that you have notes not a typed out script, but you have notes which you're not going to read, but you're going to speak. Right? So you're not just going to sit and read your notes to the audience because you now know that material so well that those are just a guideline to remind you of key points. So for instance, these slides for me are extemporaneous notes, right? They give me some key terms, they give me rough organization, and then I can expand or talk less about particular topics based on where my audience is at. So extemporaneous is kind of very, very flexible, but with far more organization than that impromptu. And it's often got far more detailed evidence because impromptu, you really don't want to make evidence up. You never want to make evidence up. And so unless you have all that stuff in your head, it's going to be really difficult to incorporate that into an impromptu speech. A manuscript is exactly what it sounds like. You have a manuscript, word for word, you are reading that speech. And we never actually want to read speeches. Really good people, for instance, folks who work with teleprompters, that's usually a word for word way to see a speech. But good speakers learn how to have the text there, but still be speaking to the audience in this conversational tone rather than standing and very boringly reading. You need to know what your topic is. This sounds really obvious, but it seems to be a step many folks are lacking. So when you're preparing and organizing your speech ideas, you do need to know your topic. You need to be able to research your topic. There's quite a lot that goes into that. And of course, write the speech. So we'll go into some more organization about that writing piece, and then we'll talk a little bit about delivery also. So once you have your topic and you know whether it's informational, entertaining, or eulogizing, or persuasive, you need to be able to determine an organizational pattern. And theorists have found a selection of organizational patterns, and some work better for some types of speeches than others. We've given them names because these are the common ones. You'll find a couple variations here and there, but depending on the topic of the speech, it may be far more effective to choose a spatial pattern, perhaps, rather than a topical. And I'll give you some examples of that. So topical pattern by topic, right? So if you have three things that don't really seem to be linked in any other way, or they're very disparate subjects, you're often using a topical pattern. Chronological pattern means by time. So if we're talking about historical events or things that have led up to now or things that are going to be happening in the future, chronological time is often something that's going to happen. So you're building the time on each other. Spatial pattern, think space, organization of space. Right? So I've given examples here of, say, you're going to give a speech about the Civil War. So you say, all right, first we're going to talk about the North and then the South, and then we're going to talk about Virginia because it was in the middle and went back and forth. Right? Or maybe as you take a local tour around town, or let's say, for instance, that you're giving an informative speech about a smartphone, and you first are going to talk about the new external design features, and then you're going to go to this new Gorilla Glass they're using, and then you're going to go to some of the internal components. That's still a spatial arrangement because you're selecting particular places on the phone to focus your speaking. A causal pattern, not casual, a causal pattern is you're talking about who or what is responsible. Right? So, for instance, if you want to talk about the development of AIDS, or if you want to talk about how poverty leads to prison sentences, right? So this cause and effect piece. And then a little bit different, we have what we either call a problem-solution pattern, which says, here's the problem, here's how we fix it. Or you get a little more in-depth and you call it a problem-cause-solution. So not just what's the problem, then what caused that problem, and now what's the solution now that we know these things, right? So, for instance, poverty is is related to prison sentences, and we can solve these things with increased education and job training, right? So these are just rough ideas. And then the last organizational pattern that I've listed here is one that is actually only effective for persuasive speeches. It is not useful for informative speeches. And it is called Monroe's motivated sequence. It is a 5-step pattern. And so instead of a traditional introduction, body, conclusion, the whole speech setup is a little bit different. So instead we have what we call attention, and you are grabbing the audience's attention. We then have the need step, and you're explaining to the audience what is the need in the world, what's the exigency, what needs to happen, or what is happening. The satisfaction step says, okay, this need is happening. How can we satisfy this need? How can we solve this need? And then visualization is, now that I've shown you how we can solve it, how we can satisfy the need, let me show you what the world would be like if you do. Or, alternately, let me show you what the world would be like if you don't fix it the way I've suggested. And the last one is action. And so now that I've shown you that the world looks this way and could be this way, what do you as an audience member need to do? The best way to remember this Monroe's motivated sequence that I've found is to think about the Ginsu knife commercials, the infomercials, where it said, don't you get so upset when you can't, cut a piece of lumber and this tomato all with the same knife, right? So obviously you have this need in your life, and this is a need that you can't do all of these things with the same set of shears. And so how can you solve this need? Well, look, I have the answer. I have this brand new set of shears. This is what you need. Let me show you the world once you own this set of shears. Here's all of the crazy food and things in your life that you can make with just this one thing. And all you have to do is call now. And for $19.95 plus $47 in shipping and handling, we'll send you not one, but 5 brand new sets of shears. Right? So honestly, go and look up any infomercial and break down, here are the 5 steps of Monroe's motivated sequence, and you can see it's very clearly laid out in most infomercials. You'll also notice that each of the 5 steps do not get equal time paid to them. Attention is often very short. Action, it's not necessarily as short as attention, but most of the time is spent in those middle steps. So these are organizational patterns you have likely seen before. These are organizational patterns in general you are able to also use for papers. But do be aware that depending on your topic, depending on your audience, you need to be able to suit your speech and the speech pattern to be most effective for that moment. So just a quick overview. Outlines are important. We outline in order to know, oh, by the way, this was my main point, and here's how I'm going to support it, and here's my evidence for that. So actually writing things out in an outline form is very helpful. I know some folks feel like they don't need them. I'll tell you, with speeches, it helps a lot. Helps with papers too. Right now we're talking speeches. So this screen is really just a reminder of kind of what basic formatting for outlining looks like, and to give you a reminder of kind of how you break it down a little bit more. And some other really big pieces about writing the speech. Tell us what we don't know. Don't make your audience do the work. Give them the information. Don't make them read your mind. Which means you need to know your audience, and you need to be able to adapt to, okay, here's the type of information I think this audience has, but just in case, I'm going to know how to give a little bit more if they look confused. But I know that this is probably new information, so I have to make sure I cover that very well and clearly. You need clear organization, and some things that really, really help with organization is to have particular key terms and to define them. Tell your audience how you're working with terms. To use what we call signposts, to transition between ideas, and to use internal summaries. So off to the right here, I've given you some vocabulary, some terms that are meant to help guide your audience through your speech. Right? So remember, they're not reading it, they have to listen. And we often have a hard time listening. So you want to do as much work of this as you can for your audience. So you want to tell them, hey, this is my first point, this is my second point, these are the 3 points we're going to spend more time with, my final point, here are 2 ways this happens, right? Give them the information. Transition between ideas for them. Help guide them from idea to idea. Right? So some of the examples here are, for example, nevertheless, in summary, therefore, why should we care? Right? These are really useful phrases, and so be careful how you use them, because they are ones that the audience catches to help guide through. And then what we call an internal summary is, right, you go in and you say, and here's what I've just talked about, and here's why it matters. Right? Here's my quick overview. So I definitely recommend making note of some of the phrases that show up here on the right. And they work well in papers also. So two very important parts of a speech when we're talking about organization and writing: the introduction and the conclusion. They should be a maximum of 10% each of the speech. They are some of the most important parts of a speech because they're what the audience hears first and they're what the audience hears last, and often a lot of stuff in the middle gets lost. But even though they're so important, they're only a maximum of 10% each. Right? And so you really want to be very succinct in kind of boiling down your message and really telling people why it's important, why it is important. And you want to give people that organization pattern of here's what we're going to talk about. Right? You're going to give them a roadmap. So we talked about kind of those signposts in speeches. The introduction should give people a roadmap, and then those signposts help keep them guiding. And in conclusion, you always want to come back to main points, right? So where have we been? Right? What have we seen? Why does it matter? And you want to end on a strong note. So I've got this little note here that says bookends. So often when we start a speech, we start with some stats or a story or something that's related to the topic and catches the audience's attention. And what's often a very useful tool is to then come back to that same story, those same statistics at the end, and remind people of why it mattered and why it was related. So that's called bookending. Right, you put one on each end. And the other piece I want to note about conclusions is what sometimes happens when people feel like they're running out of time is they rush through their main points and then they run out of time and they just drop the conclusion. And I will tell you that a much stronger strategy is to, in your outline, in your speaking notes, make note of what you can drop in the middle of the speech, right? So if you're telling people that you're going to have 3 main points, you want to be able to address all 3 main points, but maybe you don't go into as much detail with each of them as you meant to once you realize that time is running short. But you always want to keep your conclusion. Do not drop your conclusion if you're running short of time, right? Find other places to cut, drop some of the extra detailed evidence if you need to, but always include your conclusion. And ideally, you've practiced this speech out loud often enough that you know how fast you speak. You know that you're probably going to speak a little bit faster in front of an audience. And so you've already timed out how to address everything that you need to in an accurate amount of time. But sometimes things happen, right? And so just be prepared for, oh no, obviously we're going to go a couple minutes over. How do we make up for that, right? Do not drop the conclusion. So some reminder of delivery do's and don'ts. Look at the audience. You want to be able to ideally make eye contact with different members of your audience around the room. If it makes you uncomfortable so far to make eye contact, what you can do is pick a spot a little bit over the shoulder of a couple people in different places in the room, because it still looks like you're looking at people's faces. I strongly suggest, if there's a good listener, right, so every class I'm in, there's usually at least one person who's really good about smiling and nodding and being interactive as they're listening. Find that person, right? And look at them. Don't stare at them. That gets creepy, right? But look back to them occasionally, because having an engaged listener helps things along so much. And if there's that person yawning, ignore it. It's not you. They're going to do that in any case. Don't be monotone. Mix up your voice. The other big thing about this is, I think we often forget how much you can infect the audience with your enthusiasm if you sound enthusiastic. The audience will care a lot much more about a topic if it sounds like you do. So how to make your voice sound enthusiastic rather than Bueller, Bueller, Bueller. So give it some emphasis. And yeah, so like there's these things called vocal pauses, and yeah, so like they get actually really pretty distracting. Yeah, distracting for the audience, and so you generally want to avoid things like that. If you know you say ums, if you know you say yes, if you know you say likes, if you know you smack your lips, be aware of these things and stop doing them. Because I'm sure we've all had that professor or that friend we see public speak, and you start counting the likes and the ums, and you're no longer listening to the speech anymore. And so be aware of what you do and practice enough that you can reduce how often you do it. When you're very comfortable with the information, that helps it flow much more smoothly. But you also really have to be aware of how fast you're talking, because sometimes you can talk way too fast for people to understand. So for instance, like if you're giving, my example here is that if I want to talk about the cheetah's life cycle and how it's environmentally friendly, then, it's at risk because of hunting. Again, people are going to stop listening, and you're going to be out of breath. But you also can't speak too slowly, so find a good rate. And this is why practice is so important. Some of the other comments that I've put on here are things like the flamingo impression, seasickness. The audience can see your body, and they pay attention to your body. I will tell you that they cannot see you sweating. They cannot see how clammy your hands are. They usually cannot see that your hands are shaking, which I know these are things that many of us fear. But they can see when you're standing on one leg, and a lot of us do it. They can see when you are swaying back and forth from foot to foot. They can see that you're chewing gum, or that your hat is still on, or that your hands are in your pockets, or that you're playing with your hair, or whatever. So know what your body does. And there are times to use your body for positive effect, right? So you can move to different parts of the room to help emphasize things, to help show your motion through the speech. But you want to know what your body's doing, and you want to be in control of that. And then also be aware of how you use the things around you. So for instance, if you have a clicky pen and you are a pen clicker, it's likely that you may not know this, but everyone around you does, because as you can hear, it's incredibly annoying when it happens constantly. So put the pen down. If you know you're a pen clicker and you feel like you need to have a pen, make sure it doesn't click, right? Set yourself up for success, but this means knowing what are your things and accounting for them. And how and when to use visual aids. It's important to know that visual aids are not in place of your speech. You shouldn't be able to have your visual aid and be like, okay, I don't actually have to speak because everything's on here, right? You do not want every screen, if you're going to use slides, you don't want every screen filled with words. There's actually a lot of really good resources about how to minimize that, what to focus on, right? So you want short bullet points. You can include full-length quotations if you're trying to kind of point out to the audience, look at these amazing words that someone said. You do need to include citations when you're using slides. And if all goes to hell and technology dies, you need to be able to present without it. And sometimes if you had planned on having a video or if you'd planned on having a chart, those can be difficult because those are great things to include on visual aids. But you have to find ways to work around it because technology does fail, and it happens. When you're using a visual aid, you need to not talk to the visual aid. You need to not talk to the screen. You still need to talk to your audience. And you not only need to direct your comments to the audience, you actually need to talk to your audience about what they're seeing on the screen. So you need to tell them what they're seeing. If there's something in particular they should be looking for, you want to tell them why it matters. Tell them why you're including it. And it's really crucial that you have practiced with your visual aid. If you have a video, have an assistant, right? Don't be the person who's trying to set up videos and change screens and go to websites while you're speaking. If there are multiple people going up there, someone else is in charge of taking care of that visual aid stuff while you are a dedicated speaker. If you're the only speaker, there's usually someone around to help you because you're a big enough deal, and so you can ask for that assistance. Always check the technology, make sure it works. Check the sound on your videos before you're in the middle of the speech. Check that the internet is working, right? Be prepared for what's going to happen. So talking to the audience, tell them what they're seeing, what they should look for, why it matters. Have an assistant, check the technology, and use visual aids to support a speech, not to take its place. And we can talk more about what that looks like if you would like. There's a lot of great references about it. And just as a heads up, I know that a lot of folks really like to use Macs, and I will tell you that the folks that I know who are in the real world, right, academics is a little bit different, One of the things that I've heard is coming out of undergrad, going into a job, they were surprised that so much of their job was creating presentations, was creating PowerPoints specifically, and for instance, not being allowed to use new technologies such as Prezi. And the reason for that is you have to think about when a company has protected information, Prezi is an open source available on the internet. Other people can access your information, whereas PowerPoint is enclosed within a system. And so even folks who loved using as fancy as Prezi is, they got to start working in companies and were told they could no longer use it. A lot of businesses do not use Keynote or Mac products. And so even though PowerPoint feels old, I do recommend having some familiarity with it and also making the most of the help guides. There's a lot of really cool aids that you can do in PowerPoint. You can automatically set up the screens, you can get effects, and there are help guides to do all of those things. So, one thing that a lot of folks have trouble with is how to not read your notes. And so this slide is in here just to give you a sense of when I talk about speaking notes, what that looks like. So for instance, if you're talking about a complex topic, you probably need some background notes. Don't try to memorize because then it's terrible when this happens. People forget an entire main point and then are just stuck up there. So even if you don't think you're going to need them, prepare speaking notes, put them in a large font, put them on a thick piece of paper or a large note card. If you've got this flimsy, loud piece of paper, it often becomes a problem. Always, always, always number your note cards very clearly in case you mix them up. I do things like highlighting. I write in short sentences. I have my own kind of codes to myself. And so what's on the screen are actually speaking notes that I've used for presentations about research projects. And so, for instance, I would be able to tell you, looking at this, that I'm examining the passport, and it's important because these are key pieces of identity and identification. And they're marking not only who belongs within borders as citizens, but then also who is outside of them. And what is that concept of citizen, right? So all of the little kind of shorthand here, when I underline things, my equal signs, I've got notes to myself, when I'm supposed to point at things on the screen behind me, right? Give yourself these tools. Don't make up such a code that you don't understand it yourself, right? That you have to give yourself enough to be able to explain to your audience. And you'll also note that there are citations included in here. You do have to include oral citations within speaking. And so you need to know where those should be included and what it is you're saying. So everybody can come up with their own, but do not try and read a written out script. You need to develop speaking outlines. Overall, remember that the evidence that you use to support your arguments are crucial to a strong speech, as well as these things we've talked about with organization and delivery and preparation. These are things you're also going to have in essay writing. And so the more details about how to select which evidence to use or not will actually be covered in another short lecture. So I will see you there shortly.